Growing up, we were always told about our Estonian origins. Even as a little kid, my Vanema, my grandmother, I guess, but we always called her Vanema. That's how we always associated our two grandmothers. So my mother's mother was Vanema, and then my dad's mother was grandmom. And we always knew that we were Estonian, and we in the town that we grew up in, and right outside of Seabrook, New Jersey, there was a large Estonian population. So it was always we always did Estonian traditions for parties. We always had a kringle cake and all the other different Estonian foods. And we were always told that my grandfather, my mother's father, had passed away before I was born, and we were always told about how they both escaped Estonia back in 1944 during World War II, and lived in Germany for 6 years, and then they came over to the States. And it was always kind of like Estonia was this mystical land of we were always told about Vikings and very tall people. We were like, oh, a lot of our cousins and second cousins were like 6'8", 6'9", just very tall. I don't know what that is in meters, but yeah. So it was always like we were always connected to Estonia, and we always associated ourselves with being even Estonian. So even going to school, you have your heritage days, and we always talk about our Estonian background. And a lot of the kids in the United States kind of had no idea what that was. Almost people thought we were making it up. Maybe once or twice a year we had go to an Estonian event, and for as a kid you're like the weird food that's happening. I always associate Estonian food with fish heads. I haven't seen that here, but I remember being, even as a kid, we go to an Estonian party, and that was the one thing I was not looking forward to, was the food. You're very picky when you're a child, and you just see the fish, and you see the fish head and the eyeball, and you're just like, I'm not gonna do that. And we used to always have smoked eel, which I've grown to like, but just something with seeing faces on your food always a little. But and then also the cakes, you're like, oh, that looks like a sweet dessert, but it has blood sausage in it. And we used to always think that, you think of Superman is from Krypton, you're like, oh, we're from Estonia, that was our Krypton. And it being not available to us during, for the first 6 or 7 years, or since 91. I was born in 83. Yeah, so it was about 9 or 10 when Estonia got their freedom. It was always a land that we could never go to, and we could not, we just hear stories about it. And it wasn't until till Estonia got their independence, and my relatives started going over and visiting, that it started becoming more real. When my Vanema passed away, she left a little bit of money to all of her grandchildren to make a trip to Estonia. So in 2002, I made the trip. I was 19 years old. I came with my brother, my mother, and my uncle, and we came to Tallinn, and then we went to Saaremaa and saw the bunker where my mother was lived in the first few months of her life because of the bombings in Germany. And then we went to the point, to the lighthouse where they were shipped off to when they had to escape the island. I was appreciative at the time, but I think being 19, I still felt like a teenager. I have to admit, I still was a kid, and you're kind of you hear the history, and you're like, blah, 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 and it's all it's all hitting you at once, and you're just not I don't know if it's going in or, it's processing or anything. But taking this trip now that I'm in my early 30s, it's been great. It's almost like a second chance for that trip, and really appreciating and doing my own documentation for the areas where my family had lived, and visiting the same bunker that we visited. Things are changing. Everything is getting built up, so it doesn't feel like this. It almost doesn't feel as authentic in some of the areas. Even the spot where my mother and her mother and her family shipped off, there was a construction site, and they were building something there, and it felt like it's going to be something touristy. And I think it's going to be slowly losing its magic to a certain extent, but I'm just happy that I got a chance to come now. One of my regrets, and one of my mother's biggest regrets, is not teaching me the Estonian language, and me not learning the Estonian language. We, growing up, my mother thought it would be too confusing for us to learn both languages in the household. Just learning English seemed hard enough for her, so, might as well have us try to get it right. And now being, 31, and there doesn't seem to be an excuse for me not to, start learning or taking the initiative to learn the Estonian language. I can keep saying, oh, it's one of the hardest languages to learn, but it's a bad excuse to have. I feel like people say that and they're just not putting the effort in. I have both. I have two citizenships. I have a citizenship to the United States and a citizenship to Estonia. It's funny, as a child, I always identified as I'm half Estonian, or I'm Estonian. I feel like that's gone away a little bit now. I don't identify as much. I think I'm becoming, or I am my own person, and I've had my own upbringing, and I've only grown up in the States. I mean, deep down, I have to say I am an American. When I was a child, I never knew my grandfather, my mother's father. His name was Carl, and we always knew that he was an engineer. He was an engineer when he studied engineering when he was in Estonia. He escaped the Estonian army, or he escaped the Russian army. He was an Estonian fighting on the Russian lines, and he escaped. He just left the Russian army, which I think what I always heard terrified him. He was always kind of looking over his back, and he actually walked from Russia escaped from Russia and went back to Estonia, and then eventually back to Saaremaa, and fled with my grandmother. And we always thought oh, he was an excellent drawer, and I was like, oh, that's where we got my artistic talent from. It has to be from this man, because we never knew who he was. And then after my grandmother passed away, we discovered that he really wasn't my mother's father. And so what happened with that was that my grandmother became pregnant before having relations with Carl, or there was a lot of stuff going on in the war, and it was an Estonian soldier, or Estonian, but it was fighting for the German side, and we never knew what happened to that man. And I found this out when I was about 16 or 17 years old, and it's like, wait, what? How did this happen? And we never really found out who that person was. But when Carl when he escaped from Russia, from the Russian army, he ended up having relations with two other women within that same year and bearing two children. And then he fled with my grandmother, and we never knew about this until after my grandmother's death. It was definitely eye-opening to hear the story and just kind of discover your different, that your roots are splintering off from what you used to think they were. Growing up, it's always the what if, what if they stayed? What if they didn't go to the United States? I always joke around oh, maybe I would have been Australian, or, maybe living on some sort of village. So there's a part of me that feels fortunate that things happened the way they did. Obviously, my existence wouldn't have happened if things didn't go the way they did. But you kind of, knowing that there was a direct point in time, and, figuring out oh, if they decided to do X, Y, and Z, I wouldn't exist. I wouldn't have happened. So growing up with that's always been something that's rolled in my brain.